Okay, let's start with a scenario that I think everyone can visualize, even though it's happening on a, microscopic scale.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine you are a single cell. Let's say you're an epithelial cell lining the gut, or maybe a skin cell on the tip of your finger. You're part of this massive, sprawling metropolis that is the human body, but
Yeah.
then suddenly there's a breach.
Right.
You get poked by a thorn or burned by stomach acid, or a bacteria lands on your surface and starts, I don't know, drilling.
Yeah.
You are in immediate mortal danger.
And in that moment, the clock is ticking. You absolutely cannot afford to wait.
Right, you can't wait for the brain to notice. You can't wait for a hormone to travel all the way from the pituitary gland, circulate through the, miles of blood vessels, and finally find you.
That's like sending a letter via the Pony Express when your kitchen is on fire. It's not the right tool for the job.
You need to scream. You need to
Ah.
grab the cell standing next to you and shake it. You need a local emergency broadcast system.
That is the perfect framing for today's deep dive. We are so accustomed to thinking of pharmacology in terms of let's call them the aristocrats of the body hormones, like insulin or adrenaline.
The long-distance signals.
Exactly. They act like radio broadcasts. They travel long distances and speak to the whole body at once. But today, today we are down in the trenches. We're talking about the working class signals, the whispers, the shouts from cell to cell.
We're talking about signals made from fat. And specifically, we are unpacking the world of lipid-derived autacoids.
Autacoids. It's a term that often gets glossed over in introductory classes, but the etymology tells you everything you need to know. It comes from the Greek autos, meaning self, and akosis, meaning remedy or healing agent.
Self-remedies.
Self-remedies, or as you said, local hormones. They are biological agents that are synthesized on demand, act locally, what we call paracrine or autocrine signaling, and are destroyed almost instantly.
So they're incredibly fleeting.
Unbelievably so. We're talking seconds to minutes. But in those few seconds they exist, they make life or death decisions. They decide if you feel pain. They decide if you get a fever. They decide if your blood clots to save you from bleeding out, or if your airway's close up to stop you from inhaling a toxin.
And to navigate this really complex web, we are synthesizing the two Bibles of pharmacology. We've got Katzung's Basic and Clinical Pharmacology, specifically the chapter on eicosanoids. And that's going to be our clinical map. It tells us what happens when we use drugs to hack this system.
And then to understand the machinery under the hood, we are leaning heavily on Goodman and Gilman's The Pharmacological Basis of Therapeutics, chapter 37. That's our molecular manual. Katzun tells us, for example, that aspirin prevents heart attacks. Goodman and Gilman explains the atomic physics of why.
So the mission for this deep dive is to layer those two perspectives. We want to understand how the body uses its own structural walls, literally the cell membranes, as a factory to manufacture these potent fleeting signals.
And we have some crucial takeaways to hit. First, on-demand manufacturing, why these things aren't stored in a warehouse. Then the fork in the road, where the raw material can go down two very different paths with very different outcomes.
We also need to get into the vascular tug-of-war. That's the balance between clotting and flowing. And finally, the big one, the so what of inhibition. Why blocking one of these pathways, like we famously did with Vioxx, can lead to disaster.
It's a fantastic story of systems biology.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. The raw material. You mentioned signals made from fat. Now, usually when I think of fat, I think of energy storage, adipose tissue, or, the cholesterol I'm trying to keep down. I don't think of fat as a high-speed communication network.
And you're not alone in that. But that is exactly what your cell membranes are. We tend to think of the cell membrane as just a skin, a sort of passive plastic bag holding the cell together.
Just a container.
Right. But Goodman and Gilman makes it crystal clear. The membrane is a dynamic, living inventory of signaling potential.
So it's a brick wall, but the bricks are explosives.
That's a vivid way to put it. I like that. The bricks are phospholipids. Now, if you look at the structure of a phospholipid, it has this glycerol backbone. And attached to that backbone are fatty acid tails.
Right.
The cell is incredibly specific about what it puts where. At the second carbon position, what biochemists call the SN2 position, the cell deliberately esterifies a very specific 20-carbon fatty acid called arachidonic acid.
Arachidonic acid, that's the key player here.
That is the parent molecule of this entire universe. It's an essential fatty acid derivative, which means we can't make it from scratch. We have to get its precursor, linoleic acid, from our diet.
So what you eat literally becomes your signaling potential.
literally.
Yeah.
And chemically, arachidonic acid is a beast. It has 20 carbons and 4 double bonds.
And why do the double bonds matter so much?
Well, the double bonds put kinks in the chain. They make the molecule bent and chemically unstable. They also provide these perfect sites for enzymes to attack and add oxygen. A saturated fat, like butter, is stable. It's straight, it stacks nicely, it just sits there. Arachidonic acid is chemically primed to react. It's volatile.
So the cell takes this volatile reactive molecule, arachidonic acid, and it locks it away into the structural wall of the cell at that specific SN2 position. And as long as it's locked in the wall, it's dormant.
Precisely. It is biologically inert. It is just a structural component, helping to keep the membrane fluid and flexible. This is the sleep state. The body has stockpiled the raw material for inflammation in every single one of your cell membranes, but it's safely locked away.
So what pulls the pin? What wakes the dragon?
The trigger is almost always a disturbance in the force, so to speak. Physical trauma, literally cutting or crushing the cell, a chemical burn. Or, more commonly, a signal from the immune system, like a cytokine docking on a receptor on the cell surface.
And all of those lead to one thing inside the cell.
They all converge on one universal intracellular event: a spike in free calcium.
Calcium is the key.
Calcium is the activation code. When intracellular calcium rises, it binds to and activates an enzyme called phospholipase A2, specifically a version called the cytosolic phospholipase A2, or CPLA2.
Okay, let's break that name down. Phospholipase. It's an enzyme that I assume cuts phospholipids.
It's a molecular pair of scissors, and it's incredibly specific. It doesn't just go and chop up the wall randomly.
Yeah.
It translocates from the cytosol to the membrane, finds that SN2 position we talked about, and it snips the bond holding the arachidonic acid to the glycerol backbone.
It frees the beast.
Frees the beast. And this is the rate-limiting step.
So this is the most important concept in the whole synthesis pathway.
Absolutely. Everything that happens after this, the production of pain signals, the fever, the clotting, it all happens at lightning speed. It's automatic. But this first step, the release of arachidonic acid by PLA2, that's the bottleneck. That is the control point.
Because once that arachidonic acid is free in the cytoplasm, what happens?
Well, think about it. The concentration of free arachidonic acid in a resting cell is effectively zero. The moment PLA2 releases it, the concentration spikes. And because AA is so lipophilic and unstable, it will immediately be grabbed by whatever metabolizing enzymes are nearby. It can't exist in a free state for long.
I found a fascinating detail in the reading about this system check, about reincorporation. It seems like the body is almost paranoid about this stuff getting out by accident.
It is terrified of accidental release.
Yeah.
And it should be. If PLA2 releases some arachidonic acid by mistake, say from a minor, insignificant calcium blip, there is a whole separate set of enzymes, bisyltransferases, whose only job is to grab that free arachidonic acid and stuff it immediately back into the membrane.
It's a constant safety check. Like, is this a real emergency? No. Okay, put the grenade back in the box.
Exactly. Inflammation is metabolically expensive and it's tissue destructive. You do not want to trigger it unless you absolutely have to. That's why glucocorticoids, like cortisol, one of their main anti-inflammatory effects is to inhibit PLA2. They shut down the whole system at the source.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. They prevent the pin from ever being pulled.
They stop the release of the raw material.
Okay, but let's say we do have to pull the pin. You stepped on a rusty nail, calcium spikes, PLA2 activates, and now you have a flood of free arachidonic acid in the cell. Now we reach what you called the fork in the road.
Right. Picture a river delta. The arachidonic acid is the water rushing down the main river. Suddenly, the channel splits. And depending on what kind of cell you are, a platelet, a white blood cell, an endothelial cell, you will have different channels open, different enzymes present.
So the cell's identity determines its response.
Precisely. There are three main channels, but for today, we really need to focus on two. Number one is the cyclooxygenase, COX pathway, and number two is the lipoxygenase, LOX pathway.
This is the choose-your-own-adventure of inflammation. You go down the COX path, you get pain and clotting. You go down the LOX path, you get asthma and allergy.
That's a fair simplification, yeah. Let's start with that first channel, the cyclooxygenase pathway. This is the one most people are familiar with, even if they don't know the name, because it's the one we hack with aspirin and ibuprofen.
The COX enzyme itself is a fascinating machine. Goodman and Gilman describes it in such detail. It basically takes this long, snake-like arachidonic acid molecule, and what does it do? It ties it into a knot.
It cyclizes it. That's where the name comes from. It's a bifunctional enzyme. It has two active sites. First, it adds 2 molecules of oxygen. That's the oxygenase part. Then it creates a 5-carbon ring right in the middle of the chain. That's the cyclo part. This reaction turns arachidonic acid into a very unstable intermediate called PGG2, which is immediately converted by a peroxidase activity into PGH2.
PGH2, so that's the mother of all prostanoids.
Think of PGH2 as the raw dough. Depending on what baking enzymes are present in that specific cell, that PGH2 dough can be turned into a croissant, a bagel, or a loaf of bread.
What are the breads in this analogy?
They're the specific prostanoids. PGH2 can be converted by specific syntheses into prostaglandins like PG2 or PGD2, into prostacyclin, which is PGI2, or into thromboxane, which is TXA2.
So many acronyms, but the key is that they all start from this common PGH2 intermediate.
All of them. But before we even look at the products, we have to talk about the machine itself, the COX enzyme. Because as it turns out, it's not just one machine, there are two models.
The tale of two isoforms. This is arguably the most critical concept for understanding the side effects of modern painkillers. We have COX-1 and COX-2.
And they have completely different jobs.
I always use the analogy of the janitor and the riot squad.
It's the most accurate analogy we have. It works perfectly. COX-1 is the janitor. It is a constitutive enzyme. That means the gene that codes for it is always turned on, at least at a low level. Most cells in your body are constantly making a little bit of COX-1. It's just part of being a cell.
And what is the janitor doing all day?
Housekeeping. It's taking little bits of arachidonic acid that might leak out and turning it into baseline levels of prostaglandins. And these prostaglandins do boring but absolutely vital jobs.
Like what?
Well, in the stomach, they tell the lining to produce mucus and bicarbonate so your own acid doesn't burn a hole in your gut. That's called gastric cytoprotection. In the kidneys, they help regulate renal blood flow, making sure the filtering units get enough oxygen. And in your platelets, they help maintain their readiness to form a clot if needed.
So COX-1 is the peacekeeper. It's essential for basic moment-to-moment maintenance of your body.
Correct. Now, COX-2 is the riot squad. In a healthy, happy cell, the gene for COX-2 is silent. You can barely find the enzyme. But if there is a trauma, if that rusty nail pierces the skin, the cell gets hit with inflammatory signals like cytokines, TNF-alpha, or interleukin-1.
The alarm bells.
The alarm bells go to the nucleus, and they flip the switch on the COX-2 gene.
And it's not a trickle of production, right? It's an explosion.
It is massive upregulation. Within hours, the cell is flooded with COX-2 enzymes. And the job of COX-2 is not housekeeping. Its job is to take that flood of arachidonic acid that PLA2 just released and convert it into the enormous amounts of prostanoids needed to drive inflammation, pain, and fever.
So purely from a strategic standpoint, if I have a headache or arthritis or a fever, I want to send the riot squad home. I want to block COX-2. But I probably want to leave the janitor alone because, I like my stomach lining intact.
That is the holy grail. That is what pharmacology spent 30 years and billions of dollars trying to achieve. But as we'll see, it's not that simple. The body is more complicated than that.
Before we get to the drugs, though, let's meet the cast of characters. The COX enzyme makes PGH2, and then that gets turned into these specific signals. Let's start with the big one, PGE2.
Prostaglandin E2, this is the generalist. It's produced in almost every tissue during inflammation. But in the context of this deep dive, we should focus on what it does to your nervous system and your brain. PGE2 is the great sensitizer.
What does that mean exactly? Does it cause pain directly?
That's a great question. And the answer is not really. If I injected pure PGE2 into your arm, it wouldn't hurt that much immediately. But what it does is it dramatically lowers the activation threshold of your nociceptors, your pain-sensing nerve endings.
So it's not the thing that's screaming, it's the thing that turns up the volume on the microphone.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Imagine your nerves are like a motion sensor light. Normally, it takes a big movement like a person walking by to turn them on. PGE2 sneaks in and recalibrates the sensor so that now even a tiny dust mote or a gentle breeze sets the alarm off.
So after PGE2 floods the injured tissue, things that normally wouldn't hurt, like the gentle throbbing of your pulse or the friction of your shirt against your skin, suddenly become agonizing.
That's the definition of hyperalgesia, and it does the same thing in the brain. PGE2, produced locally in the brain's vasculature, crosses the blood-brain barrier, it travels to the hypothalamus, the body's thermostat, and it resets the set point.
It hacks the thermostat.
It tricks your brain into thinking 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit is too cold.
So you start shivering to generate heat, you constrict blood vessels in your skin to conserve it, you get a fever.
And when you take an ibuprofen, you block the production of that PGE2 in the brain. The thermostat resets to normal and your body says, whoa, it's hot in here. So you start sweating to cool down. fever broken.
It's so elegant when you see the mechanism. Now, let's look at the most dramatic relationship in this whole story, the one you called the vascular tug-of-war. This is the yin and yang of blood clotting.
This is a concept that Goodman and Gilman emphasizes because it explains so much about cardiovascular pharmacology. It explains why aspirin works and why Vioxx failed. We have two major players here with opposing actions, thromboxane A2, VXA2, and prostacyclin, PGI2.
Let's start with thromboxane. The name just sounds aggressive.
It is aggressive. Thromboxane is the primary COX product of platelets. Now remember, platelets are just little cell fragments floating around in your blood. Their only job is to find and plug leaks. They are packed with the COX-1 enzyme, the janitor, and when they're activated, they use it to churn out thromboxane.
And thromboxane has a very clear two-part message.
A very clear message. Clot and constrict. It tells the smooth muscle in the blood vessel wall to clamp down. That's vasoconstriction. And it's a potent platelet aggregator. It tells other platelets to get sticky and pile on.
So if you cut your finger, this is the hero. It's what stops you from bleeding out. But if this happens inside a coronary artery that's already narrowed by plaque...
It causes a heart attack. It forms the thrombus that blocks the vessel.
So to prevent us from just clotting to death randomly, we have a counterforce.
We have to have one. And that's prostacyclin, PGI2. This is made by the endothelial cells, the beautiful, smooth, Teflon-like single layer of cells that lines all of your blood vessels.
And what do they use to make it?
They use their COX enzymes, both COX-1 and, importantly, COX-2, which is induced by shear stress, to make prostacyclin. And its message is the exact polar opposite of thromboxane. Prostacyclin's message is flow and relax.
So it tells the blood vessel to open up vasodilation, and it tells the platelets, do not stick here, keep moving, nothing to see here.
It is the most potent endogenous inhibitor of platelet aggregation known. So your entire cardiovascular health, from one moment to the next, is essentially a stalemate, a dynamic balance. On one side, you have platelets shouting, clot, and on the other, you have the endothelium shouting, flow.
And under normal conditions, they cancel each other out, keeping blood liquid, but always ready to gel if the vessel wall is broken.
That balances everything.
This sets the stage perfectly for Section 3, clinical pharmacology. Because when we introduce NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, we are no longer observers. We are tossing a wrench into this incredibly delicate machinery. Let's talk about the grandfather of them all, aspirin.
Aspirin, or acetylsalicylic acid. It is unique. We group it with ibuprofen and naproxen, but chemically, it behaves in a completely different and, frankly, much more interesting way. Most drugs are reversible inhibitors.
Meaning they come and go.
Yeah, they're like a key that fits in a lock but doesn't turn. It just blocks the hole for a while. Eventually, it falls out, and another key can get in. Aspirin is a suicide inhibitor.
Okay, let's visualize the mechanism here. The critique said we need to really see this.
Okay, so imagine the COX enzyme is a long, narrow tunnel. Deep inside that tunnel is the catalytic site, the machine that twists the arachidonic acid. The arachidonic acid has to swing down this hydrophobic tunnel to get processed.
And aspirin swims into that same tunnel.
Aspirin enters the tunnel, but it doesn't just sit there. Aspirin carries a chemical payload, an acetyl group. When it reaches a specific amino acid deep inside the tunnel, a serine residue at position 530, it detonates. It physically transfers that acetyl group onto the serine molecule.
It forms a covalent bond.
Yes, a covalent bond. This isn't a temporary stick. This is a permanent chemical weld. It fundamentally changes the shape of the tunnel. It puts a permanent, bulky roadblock in the way. Even after the rest of the aspirin molecule leaves, that acetyl scar remains. The tunnel is blocked forever.
That enzyme is dead.
It is catalytically destroyed. It will never process another molecule of arachidonic acid.
So if I take an aspirin, I have effectively murdered the COX enzymes in my body. But here's the nuance that separates the casual reader from the expert. Why does this one pill thin my blood for days? I mean, the aspirin itself is gone from my body in under an hour.
This brings us back to basic cell biology, and it's so clever. Let's think about the two sides of our tug of war. If aspirin destroys the COX enzyme in an endothelial cell, the one making the flow signal, prostacyclin, what happens? Well, endothelial cells are complete living cells. They have a nucleus, they have DNA, they have ribosomes. They realize, hey, our COX enzyme is broken. So they simply go back to the blueprint, the DNA, and synthesize new COX protein.
They just rebuild the factory.
Exactly. Within a few hours, the endothelium has new functional COX enzymes and is back to making prostacyclin flow. But now consider the platelet.
Oh, okay.
Platelets are not true cells. They're just fragments that budded off from a larger cell, the megakaryocyte, in the bone marrow. They have NO nucleus, they have NO DNA.
So they can't rebuild the factory. There's no blueprint.
They are biologically incapable of synthesizing new protein. If aspirin hits a platelet and destroys its KOX1 enzyme, that platelet is permanently disabled. It can never make thromboxane clot again for the rest of its natural life.
And a platelet lives for how long?
About 7 to 10 days.
Okay, the light bulb just went on.
So think about the math. A single low-dose aspirin permanently knocks out the clot signal in your entire circulating population of platelets for a week.
Ugh.
Meanwhile, the endothelium recovers the flow signal in just a few hours. You have fundamentally and lastingly shifted the entire balance of the tug-of-war.
You've permanently handicapped the clot side while the flow side recovers quickly and completely.
And that is why low-dose aspirin is cardioprotective. It's not about the aspirin in your blood. It's about the permanent scar it leaves on a population of enucleated cells. It's a brilliant, accidental discovery of pharmacology.
But, and this is a huge but, there's a trap here, a very practical clinical interaction that listeners need to know about. The interaction between aspirin and ibuprofen. Let's go back to the tunnel analogy.
Right. Ibuprofen, Advil, Motrin, and also naproxen, LA, are reversible competitive inhibitors. They swim into that same COX tunnel and they park there. They're bulky. They clog the channel. But they don't create that covalent bond. They just sit there blocking traffic, and then eventually they wash out.
So imagine a patient. Let's call him Bob. Bob is taking his daily 81 milligram low-dose aspirin for his heart. But he wakes up with a stiff back, so he pops 2 ibuprofen first thing. 30 minutes later, he remembers and takes his morning aspirin. What happens at the molecular level?
The ibuprofen got there first. It has already parked in the tunnel the platelet COX1 enzyme. It is physically occupying the active site. The aspirin swims along looking for that serine 530 to attach its acetyl payload to, but it can't get in. The driveway is blocked. The aspirin just bounces off.
And aspirin has a very short half-life in the blood, doesn't it?
Incredibly short, about 15 to 20 minutes before it's deacetylated. So the aspirin circulates for a bit, finds no open targets in the platelets, it gets broken down by the liver or excreted, it's gone. A few hours later, the ibuprofen backs out of the driveway. It washes out.
And the tunnel is open again. The enzyme works. But the aspirin, the permanent killer, is gone. The opportunity was missed.
Bob has achieved 0 permanent platelet inhibition for that day. He thinks he's protected from a heart attack or stroke, but chemically he has completely neutralized his life-saving medication with his painkiller.
The FDA actually issued a warning about this. The timing is critical.
You must take the aspirin first. Let it get into the empty tunnel, detonate its payload, and kill the enzyme forever. Wait at least 30 to 60 minutes. Then you can take your ibuprofen. By then, the irreversible damage to the platelets is done.
That is a life-saving detail. It shows you can't just think of drugs as painkillers. You have to think about molecular geometry, timing, and competition at the active site.
It's pharmacology in action.
Now let's talk about the other major drug story in this space. The cautionary tale of Vioxx and the Coxibs. This goes right back to that janitor versus riot squad concept.
In the 1990s, this was the biggest idea in pharma. The logic was so seductive. We knew that standard NSAIDs like ibuprofen and naproxen were non-selective. They block both KOX1, the janitor, and KOX2, the riot squad.
And blocking KOX2 is great. It stops the pain and inflammation.
But blocking KOX1, the janitor, stops the production of that protective prostaglandin in the stomach. The result, gastric ulcers and bleeding. A huge clinical problem.
A deadly problem for many people. So the hypothesis was simple. Let's build a drug that only fits in the KOX2 tunnel. Let's design a key that only opens one of the 2 doors.
Selective KOX2 inhibitors. The idea was spare the janitor, target the riot squad, get all the pain relief with none of the stomach ache. And technically, based on the crystal structure of the enzymes, they did it. Celecoxib, Celebrex, and Rovacoxib, Vioxx, were launched. They were blockbusters. Stomach ulcer rates dropped significantly. It seemed like a massive win.
But then the post-market surveillance data started trickling in. The VIGOR trial for Vioxx was a key one. People taking these drugs were having heart attacks and strokes at a significantly higher rate than those taking placebo or even old-school naproxen. Why? If we look at the tug-of-war, it explains it perfectly.
Let's look at the balance again. We need to be very clear.
Produced in the endothelium, primarily driven by KOX2.
Produced in platelets, driven entirely by KOX1.
I see the train wreck coming.
If you give a selective KOX2 inhibitor, you are very effectively blocking the production of prostacyclin. You are shutting down the flow signal. You have, in essence, cut the brake lines on the clotting system.
But You've left COX-1 completely alone.
You've left it untouched. So the platelets are still churning out thromboxane, the clot signal, at full blast. The accelerator is floored.
You created a prothrombotic state. You unbalanced the entire equation in the wrong direction.
Exactly. With a traditional non-selective NSAID like naproxen, you block both sides of the equation to some degree, so the balance, while suppressed, remains relatively neutral. But with Vioxx, you surgically remove the body's natural vascular protection prostacyclin while leaving the vascular danger thromboxane completely unchecked.
And that's why Vioxx was famously withdrawn from the market in 2004. It's just a tragic lesson in systems biology. You cannot just isolate one variable and expect no consequences. The body loves redundancy and balance. When you tip the scale, you have to know what's on the other side.
It fundamentally changed drug development. We don't just look for efficacy and GI safety anymore. We now demand cardiovascular safety outcome trials for many new drugs.
Okay, that was a deep dive into the COX pathway, the pain and clotting side of the river. But we have to go back to that fork in the road. Arachidonic acid doesn't have to go to COX. In some cells, it goes to LOX.
Section 4, the lipoxygenase pathway. This is the domain of asthma, allergy, and anaphylaxis. In certain cells, especially leukocytes like neutrophils, eosinophils, and mast cells, there's a different key enzyme called 5-lipoxygenase, or 5-LOX.
And what does it do?
When arachidonic acid meets 5-LOX, it doesn't get cyclized into a ring. Instead, it gets oxygenated into a straight-chain molecule, which then gets converted through a series of steps into a family of molecules called leukotrienes.
Leukotrienes, I love the history here. They used to be called the slow-reacting substance of anaphylaxis, SRSA.
It sounds like a 1950s horror movie title, doesn't it? But it describes the physiology perfectly. When early researchers triggered allergic reactions in isolated lung tissue, they saw two distinct phases. First, histamine was released, and it caused a quick, snappy contraction of the airway muscle. That's the fast substance.
But that wasn't the whole story.
No. Later, there was this slow, grinding, incredibly sustained, crushing constriction that just wouldn't let go. That was the slow-reacting substance, which we now know are the leukotrienes.
And how potent are they compared to histamine?
The cystinosyl leukotrienes, that's LTC4, LTD4, and LTE4, are about 1,000 times more potent than histamine at causing bronchoconstriction.
1,000 times.
1,000. If histamine is a slap in the face, leukotrienes are a chokehold that slowly tightens and doesn't let go.
And they don't just squeeze the muscle, do they?
No, they are complete airway remodelers. They cause massive secretion of thick, sticky mucus that can plug the airways. They cause mucosal edema, making the airway walls swollen and thick. And they act as chemoattractants, recruiting other inflammatory cells like eosinophils to the party. This is the biological engine of a severe asthma attack.
And this brings us to a really terrifying clinical condition called aspirin-exacerbated respiratory disease, or AERD. It's sometimes called Samter's triad. This is where the shunt hypothesis comes into play.
This is where that river-delta analogy becomes absolutely essential for clinical practice. Imagine the arachidonic acid is the river water. In a normal person, it flows down two channels, COX and LOX. Now imagine you have a patient with asthma and maybe the nasal polyps. For reasons we don't fully understand, their LOX channel is already a bit overactive.
Yeah, okay.
If you give that patient a high dose of aspirin or any other NSAID, you're effectively building a massive dam right across the COX river channel.
You block the COX enzymes. Complete.
Right. So the water level of free arachidonic acid starts to rise behind the dam. It has nowhere to go. So it forcefully shunts over and pours down the only open channel it can find, the LOX pathway.
So you inadvertently trigger a massive flood of leukotrienes into the lungs.
An absolute tidal wave.
Yeah.
The patient takes an Advil for a headache, and 30 minutes later, they're in a full-blown, life-threatening asthma attack. Not because they have a true allergy to aspirin in the traditional immune sense, but because the drug pharmacologically diverted the chemical flow into the bronchoconstriction pathway.
It's hydraulic engineering gone wrong inside the cell. So how do we treat this pathway? If antihistamines won't work, what do we do?
We have to target the leukotrienes directly. And we have two main strategies, which map perfectly onto the pathway. Strategy 1 is to go upstream and stop the production. The drug for that is Xeloton. It directly inhibits the 5-LOX enzyme itself. It's like damming the LOX river.
So it prevents arachidonic acid from ever becoming leukotrienes.
Exactly. It's effective, but can have some liver toxicity, so it's not used as much. The more common approach is strategy 2. Block the effect.
The receptor.
Block the receptor. These are the leukotriene receptor antagonists, or LTRAs. The most famous one by far is montelukast, Singulair. These drugs are antagonists at the SLT1 receptor, which is the receptor on the bronchial smooth muscle that the leukotrienes bind to.
So the leukotrienes are still floating around screaming, constrict! But the muscle has earplugs on. It can't hear the signal.
That's a perfect description. And montelukast is incredibly common now. It's an oral pill, not an inhaler, which makes it popular for long-term control. And for that specific subset of patients with aspirin-sensitive asthma, it is an absolute game changer. It directly blocks the downstream consequence of that dangerous shunt.
We've covered a lot of ground, COX and LOX, pain and asthma. There is one more lipid signal mentioned in the outline, a bit of an outlier, platelet-activating factor, or PAF.
PAF is fascinating because it breaks the pattern a little. Unlike everything else we've discussed today, PAF is not derived from arachidonic acid. It's derived from a different membrane phospholipid called glycerylphosphocholine. But the theme is the same. It's a lipid that's remodeled on demand by inflammatory cells to create a potent local signal.
The outline calls it the most potent ulcerogen known.
That sounds serious.
It is unbelievably destructive in experimental models. If you inject PAF into a lab animal, it causes the stomach lining to dissolve into ulcers almost instantly. It causes platelets to aggregate, hence the name. It causes profound vasodilation and makes capillaries so leaky that fluid pours out of the blood vessels, causing a shock-like state.
So logically, you would think, wow, if I can block PAF, I can cure septic shock, I can cure asthma, I can cure ulcers.
Yeah.
Pharma companies must have jumped all over this.
They spent billions of dollars on this idea in the 80s and 90s, and they developed potent PAF antagonists like Lexapont, and they all failed. They flopped spectacularly in big clinical trials for sepsis and other conditions.
It brings us back to the concept of redundancy. PAF is a mediator of inflammation, but it's almost never the only mediator. The immune system is like a choir. PAF is just the baritone section.
Yeah.
If you magically silence the baritones, the tenors, leukotrienes, and the sopranos, prostaglandins, and the basses, cytokines, all just keep singing, maybe even a little louder to compensate.
So the riot continues even if you arrest one of the ringleaders.
Exactly. It was a very humbling lesson for reductionist pharmacology. Just because a molecule is incredibly powerful in a test tube doesn't mean blocking that single molecule will cure a complex, multifaceted disease in a human being.
Let's zoom out for the final section, dietary manipulation. We've been talking about very specific drugs, aspirin, Vioxx, Singulair. But Section 6 suggests we can hack this system at the grocery store, the omega-3 connection. Is this just health food buzz, or is there real biochemistry here?
Oh, the biochemistry is rock solid. It goes right back to the very first thing we talked about, the bricks in the wall. We said the cell stores arachidonic acid in the membrane to use as a precursor for all these signals.
Right.
Arachidonic acid is an omega-6 fatty acid. It comes from its precursor, linoleic acid, which is found in corn oil, soybean oil, sunflower oil, and factory-farmed meats. The standard Western diet is absolutely drowning in omega-6s.
So our cell walls are packed to the gills with the raw material for intense inflammation.
We are loaded for bear. Our inflammatory potential is maxed out. But the enzymes that build the cell wall, the acyltransferases, they aren't perfectly specific. If you flood your system with omega-3 fatty acids, specifically EPA, eicosapentaenoic acid, from cold water fish like salmon, mackerel, and sardines, the cell will start grabbing EPA and putting that into the SN2 position of the membrane phospholipids instead of arachidonic acid.
So you are physically renovating your own house. You're replacing the dynamite bricks with what, duds?
With wet logs, that's a great way to put it. Here's what we call the wimpy signal theory. When inflammation happens, PLA2 activates. It reaches into the renovated wall. But instead of grabbing arachidonic acid, it grabs EPA. The coenzyme sees the EPA and says, close enough, and tries to metabolize it.
But the product is different.
The product is very different. When platelets metabolize EPA, instead of making thromboxane A2, the superpotent clotter and constrictor, they make thromboxane A3.
And thromboxane A3 is?
A WIMP. It has almost no vasoconstricting ability. It barely aggregates platelets. It's essentially inactive. However, on the flip side of the tug of war, when the endothelial cells process ETA, they make prostacyclin I3, PGI3. PGI3 is just as potent a vasodilator and anti-aggregator as the original PGI2.
Wait, I see the hack. You've completely nerfed the clot and constrict signal by turning it into the wimpy TXA3, but you've kept the flow and relax signal, PGI3, just as strong.
You have fundamentally shifted the entire hemostatic balance toward an anti-thrombotic, anti-inflammatory state. Not by blocking an enzyme with a drug, but by changing the very feedstock of the factory.
So this is why there's so much research on fish oil and heart disease.
It's one of the primary mechanisms. The Inuit populations in Greenland, who traditionally ate massive amounts of seal and whale blubber, which are very high in omega-3s, have historically had very low rates of coronary artery disease and also prolonged bleeding times. Their platelets just don't stick together as hard.
But this isn't an as-needed fix, right? I can't eat a salmon roll tonight and expect my headache to go away.
No, absolutely not. This is structural engineering. It takes weeks or months to significantly change the lipid composition of your cell membranes. You have to wait for the old bricks to be used up and swapped out for the new ones. It's a lifestyle intervention, not acute medicine.
This connects everything. The food we eat becomes the structure of our cells, which dictates the signals we can send in an emergency, which ultimately determines our risk of a heart attack or an asthma attack. It is a beautiful, unified system.
It really is. It shows that pharmacology isn't just about pills. It's about manipulating biology at every level.
We have covered a massive amount of ground, from the SN2 position on a phospholipid all the way to the pharmacy aisle and the fish counter. As we wrap up, I want to touch on that final provocative thought from the outline. The resolution of inflammation. We spent this whole deep dive talking about how the body starts a fire. How do we put it out? We used to think inflammation just ran out of gas.
That was the dogma for decades, passive resolution. The idea was that the pro-inflammatory signals get washed away or broken down, the neutrophils die off, and things just kind of go back to normal. But recent research, pioneered by people like Charles Sirhan at Harvard, has completely blown that idea wide open. Resolution is an active process.
It's not just the fire going out, it's the fire department showing up.
Exactly. The body creates a whole separate class of lipid mediators called lipoxins, resolvins, and myrisins.
Resolvins, as in to resolve.
Exactly. And myrisins, as in macrophage mediators in resolving inflammation. These signals, which are often synthesized from those same omega-3 fatty acids like EPA and DHA, they don't just stop the inflammation, they actively orchestrate the cleanup. They recruit non-inflammatory macrophages to come in and eat the dead cells and debris. They tell the neutrophils to stop swarming and to leave the area. They actively initiate tissue repair and remodeling.
So chronic disease, things like unresolved arthritis, or maybe even some aspects of long COVID. Could the problem be not too much fire, but broken sprinklers? A failure of resolution?
That is the leading edge of the entire field right now. Is chronic inflammatory disease fundamentally a failure of these resolution pathways? And if so, can we design drugs that aren't anti-inflammatories, which just block the start, but are instead pro-resolving agonists, which actually force the finish line?
That is a really hopeful note to end on. The future of pharmacology might be less about stopping the body's response and more about helping the body clean up its own mess.
It's a shift from stopping the attack to promoting the healing. A completely different philosophy.
So for the listener who wants to cement all of this knowledge, go to Katsung, the chapter on eicosanoids, look at the drug tables, memorize which NSAIDs are selective and which aren't. Look at the clinical uses for Xylitol and Montelukast. That is your clinical toolkit.
And then open Goodman and Gilman, chapter 37 on lipid-derived autacoids. Look at the detailed diagrams of the arachidonic acid cascade. Trace the carbons. Try to understand the receptor subtypes EP1, EP2, DP, FP. That is where you truly understand the deep mechanism.
Knowledge is power, but only if you understand the mechanism. Next time you reach for an aspirin, visualize that tunnel. Visualize the covalent bond on serine 530. And, maybe have some fish for dinner. Thanks for this deep dive.
My pleasure. Stay curious.